Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm a bit worried I'm going to fall off the stage if I sit here, so I prefer to stand. But I think maybe the first thing I can do is open the floor actually straight away to the audience. Do you have any questions for the panelists? A distinguished guests who have been speaking all morning. Maybe you would like to ask something. Hey, don't worry, I came prepared. So I think something that we've seen a lot today is the kind of midterm predictions, 2030 predictions and 2050 predictions to oil and gas production, consumption, demand, and so on. And I have a question related to the Russia-Ukraine crisis. I mean, a few of you have touched on it, but perhaps Giacomo and Lucia, maybe you could answer a little bit on the impact of Russia and Ukraine on the energy transition. We see from the regulatory perspective, it is supposed to lead to an acceleration of the energy transition, but you see in reality that some countries are turning to increasing coal as part of their energy mix and so on. So, Lucia, perhaps you can take the floor first.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ravi. Yeah, actually a very interesting question because at the moment and probably in the next year, we will actually have more coal-fired power stations in Europe than was the plan. We will have also more subsidies to eventually, use gas, natural gas, because it's then at least cheaper for, if you like, middle income. So in that respect, that's not good for the climate, that's not good for the emissions. But if you believe Mr. Timmermans, then he reckons that is only just for 1 year or 1.5 years, and then eventually it will accelerate. And if you look at the Repower EU plans, then yes, there will be more wind, there will be more solar, and in the end of the day, it might eventually compensate the extra CO2 we are now emitting because of the coal-fired power stations. Let's hope that is true. On the other hand, we also see that currently in the different harbors, there are real problems with respect to both the not yet imposed oil boycott, but there is a lot of self-sanctioning here going on. So there are problems in that respect in the actual harbors with respect to the amount of oil and oil products coming in and going out. And at the same, of course, the same is happening with the increased LNG coming in, but therefore also, potential problems on the LNG, on the gas market, which I also have illustrated in my talk. Yeah. I'm not very optimistic as far as 2030 being, if you like, a better world than we maybe have sketched 1 year ago, as far as CO2 is concerned.
Thank you. Yes, sure. Thank you. Well, I think it's very interesting because to me it has at least a couple of different impacts. One is clearly the fact that security of supply is obviously a major concern, which means that in the long term we're going in the right direction with energy transition. So there is even less doubt about it. The one thing though is that maybe some of the proposals, like for instance that now are being discussed for Fit for 55, such as what is considered low carbon hydrogen, some of these proposals might actually be going more in a direction of enlarging in a way the role for some of the energies that were not considered until today, maybe as from purists. As an example, we were saying that to make low carbon hydrogen just from renewables is going to be extremely challenging. Maybe there will be more room for hydrogen from nuclear as well, CCS and all that. So there is I think it's a debate that is really important, and it's taking a big impact on the discussion on some of the details of the Fit for 55 regulation from now. And surely we have an impact on how the details of this regulation are being implemented really in the next few years.
Thanks. And Mark, what do you think about the biodiesel predictions that you have made when we come to using cropland for fuel in a situation of food insecurity?
Well, you had the decency to warn me this question was coming. I mean, I think the first thing I'd say is that we've had a lot of opportunities to learn from hindsight in the last couple of years about things that we could have done differently. You know, why didn't we have a better pandemic response plan? Why did we make ourselves so dependent on Russian oil and gas? And, I think with the whole biofuel story, it started in a place around making fuel from crops, and that started sort of 20 odd years ago, and the fact that it's taken 20 years to get to a point where we've got something that in European terms is representing 5% of the transport fuels pool and globally about 3%, kind of shows you the sort of road we have to travel. So, you know, I'm not... the other thing that kind of goes with that is the regulators have... we should give the regulators a break, actually, because, you know, RED was all about crop-based, and then RED2 has kind of recognized that's imperfect, and we need to move to non-crop. So we've got the crop cap, we've got what they call, you know, the move away from high ILUC or high indirect land use change feedstocks. In other words, phasing out palm oil, basically. So I guess long story short, the regulators are recognizing that we need to find a better pathway. I think in any case, the ambitions we have up to 2050 are going to make any pathway extremely challenged. And the whole thing with food versus fuel is just another example of where what seemed like a good idea a while ago doesn't seem like quite such a good idea anymore. Sorry, very long answer, but I needed to get off my chest.
Thanks a lot. Hero, let me pass the floor to you. Has the war impacted at all your sustainability outlook at VTTI?
Well, I'm going to repeat a few things that were said then, but look, when I started working on sustainability, it was about people, planet, and profit. So that was connected to sustainable development, and the thing they taught you was to keep those three things together. Typically, when you say people, planet, and profit, people tend to hear either planet, people, or profit. That's okay, but the joke is that it's together. And if I make a parallel now to the current situation, the geopolitical situation, and as also was pointed out in the presentations, we learn that it's not enough to look at one side of the equation in energy transition, namely only the environmental aspect. Who cares about the environmental aspect if you can't run your business because there is no energy? You can't afford to heat your house because you can't afford it. Or whether you become completely dependent on a party or a country that you have serious issues with. So what does it mean to our business and the look on sustainability? Actually, I'm not all that negative about the fact. I'm very negative about the things that are happening across the globe, but if it learns us to look at those three things in conjunction, to look at them together, then at least referring to the U-curve that you mentioned, Gary, at least that we know that we're incompetent because we put our bets on the Russian energy supply, or we only made policy on CO2 reduction, and we come to the conclusion that our businesses and our citizens are unable to fuel themselves. So if that's a lesson learned, then we have a much better approach for the future. So actually it could benefit us and us as a business as well, because it reprioritizes what we're doing.
Thanks. Would anyone else like to comment on this before I change the subject? No. And from the floor?
Hi. Well, in fact, it's another question. Is that okay? Okay. So actually, this was already asked to one of the panelists, but even though I'm really curious and interested to know your point of view, like each of you and the companies, we are talking a lot about value change in terms of hydrogen, technologies, investment in terms of production, but what about the demand? I mean, what do you think is the approach that the government or institutions are taking in this way? Are we really taking part into the clients? But what are the real actions that we are developing right now? Thank you.
I saw you volunteer.
I'm sure there are other examples, but one of the things is that the term value chain has been used here quite a few times. And what I find typically in any change of direction when it comes to energy transition, you can't do it on your own. So completing that value chain all the way to the end user, but also up the chain to the people who actually create the renewable energy, is so critical. And it's also different for an oil and gas industry that used to know exactly how everything was organized, that we now have to look at new value chains, new participants, new parties entering the market, but also a different demand. And there is demand, that's the good news. It's surprising demand actually. And working with the trader also, you get the input that the demand is really on the increase, but also we don't exactly know how the ultimate demand side, how it will look like. So there's a lot of questions. You can't do it on your own. That's my first takeaway. And the second is that you have to look at more value chains and different operations in there than you do before. And also parties leaving their own territory a bit. So looking to, becoming a producer or selling something down the line. That's what strikes me in that context.
Gary, you mentioned in your presentation about the need for partnerships as well. Do you want to expand on that?
So extending on what Hiro was saying and also the previous question, I think it's a great question because at the end of the day, we've been talking about a lot of technologies, we've been talking about the future, but at the end of the day, this is a market, as you say. And what is the market? That is supply and its demand. So currently, what have we got? We've got approximately 100 million barrels a day that gets into refined products. And on any future that you look at it, what you can see is the fossil fuel percentage probably decreasing in developed markets, but again, in developing regions, that's likely to increase. So we saw the examples in Africa that were explained earlier, maybe less forest products, more LPG, etc. So the absolute demand is probably still going to stay around the same for the foreseeable future. And we've spoken about greenflation and other reasons that these things will take time. But as to how do we do that, I think if we had scaled, and this is what it comes down to, what is going to raise the demand side of the equation? It's the acceptance. And the acceptance is based on economic scalability. So by the time you've got green hydrogen that is economic and scaled, I'm certainly old and grey, but I am, as I said, inspired by the ideas and the investment that is happening today. So it does give you confidence in the future, but we're living for the now. So for the now, there are many ideas coming, and it's one of those things that from a first mover advantage, it would be great to say that everybody's going to share their ideas and it's all going to be open source and therefore we can all plug and play. But coming back to the question on partnerships, whether these are formal, whether they're informal, they do need to happen because certainly my side of the business and probably everybody, we are a cog in a value chain. So for what I'm doing, it's storage, it's logistics. But in order to do that, you need somebody to bring product and somebody to want product at the end of the day. So right now the products are clear, the technologies are fairly stable and old, but we're talking about new products. So even when we talk about hydrogen, there's different ways of it. We speak about different carriers within hydrogen. If you're doing it on its own, do you need the cryogenic state? If you do it from the ammonia, what cracking technology do you need? So for all these things, you need to think about flow rates, you need to think about the engineering, you need to think about storage, health and safety, toxicity. So all of those nobody can be an expert in everything. But if the industry does come together and says, well, listen, this is how we're going to do it, and you get a few years' notice as to what you need to build so that you can plug and play, and you can get it financed, because again, you're not going to finance an unproven technology, but if the industry says, listen, this is where we're heading, I'm sure that the banks will be receptive to that idea. So the partnerships, I think it's going to be much more informal, which is more cooperation than formalized partnerships, because we're all in the same industry, we're all going in the same direction, and for the most part, we're not even competing with each other, because these are hard fixed assets in different locations. The flows will determine what happens, not our individual brilliance. So those do come more and more important. So events like this, to meet and greet and see what's coming, this is the beginning.
Thanks very much. And I'll switch the subject a little to hydrogen that you mentioned. I would like to go to you, Matt, about hydrogen. So we've heard from EVOS Amsterdam, EVOS, about their plans. At least for EVOS Amsterdam, ammonia didn't seem to play a huge role. What do you think about the most in-demand hydrogen carriers, shall we say? Which carriers do you think most in demand today? Which hydrogen carriers do you think may come more into demand in the future?
I wish I knew the answer. I think it's I think the EVOS presentation was fantastic, as it highlighted a serious hurdle, if you like, on ammonia. And we have exactly the same issue with one of our locations, where it's next to a populated area. There's a bridge, there's a train platform behind. So in reality, your permitting will dictate a carrier in that location. In the UK, we have quite an interesting scenario building with the clusters that are developing around the UK. There was 5 carbon capture clusters, like I highlighted in the presentation. And on the back of them, to move on from the debate of different colours of hydrogen, but on the back of those clusters allows a base load of hydrogen to be produced. The application for that hydrogen can be fuel blending or natural gas blending or fuel switching or transport fuels. But the carriers to move that hydrogen between A to B, between the clusters or even between the small country of the UK, it's actually quite a challenge. So we are looking at ammonia cracking, which you looked at in a previous company I worked at, methanol as well. And that's why I mentioned as looking at it really as a syngas family, a syngas portfolio family. Including CO2 as not necessarily as a waste, so CO2 as a feedstock or CO2 as a tradable product as well. So we're looking at. I think the EVOS slide was fantastic, where they're trialing almost all 2 or 3 technologies in the terminal setting. And I think as a terminal business, we have a fantastic opportunity to, as just commented there, do a lot of almost education of the market. So they see it quite a lot on the education of the consumer on natural gas for blending in domestic applications. There's a huge education program going on there. It might not be the best use of hydrogen, but it's a huge education process. And I think we need to do that as well from this industry to the investor base and to the market as well, of where we're going. Because in reality, to answer another question that was asked before, to de-risk these projects, to get them moving forward, in reality, we have to get together and form a group, a consortium to progress the projects. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to do it as Navigator on our own. The supply chain and the product doesn't stack up, so we have to get together to de-risk.
Thanks. Any other comments on that from the panelists? Then, Lucia, where do you think this hydrogen is going to come from? And are we creating dependencies on countries that we don't want to create new dependencies with?
Thank you, Ravi, for the question. As I also pointed out in my talk, it looks like a lot of green hydrogen especially, or green ammonia for that matter, will not all be made here in northwestern Europe. So probably a lot of green hydrogen will come from elsewhere, our continent. I mentioned Morocco, Namibia, Saudi Arabia. And so therefore, potentially, after 2030, 35, new dependencies can be created, which is yet another security of supply issue, which I think already now we should consider and we should also take into account when actually going through this, if you like, the whole value chain of there where it's been supplied on the green side, where it's been made and how it's been carried and stored. But very importantly, and I think that question just came also from the audience, is where actually is the demand? I mean, who is actually going to use all this green hydrogen? I mean, we said during the afternoon that it will be either, yes, it will be the chemical and petrochemical sector, it will be the high energy, if you like, industry like steel, etc. Transport has been mentioned. In fact, the whole lot is being mentioned, but will that be true? I mean, take Maersk. I find Maersk a very good example, who is now in Denmark really homing in on ammonia for their own vessels. And actually they have therefore created the demand themselves. And I think there you have it all in one. And that eventually can grow and can grow very high or large. And that in the end of the day will do quite a trick, I would say. But okay, security of supply, yes, we have to be careful not to fall into the same trap as we have done with fossil fuels.
I think on the point there, on the supply chain piece, we actually see that the production technologies for hydrogen, for example, blue hydrogen or blue ammonia, traditionally, they're not very small. So these plants are actually very, very large, and they'll produce. We're in the same discussion right now back home, where there's a big problem in terms of the dispatchable power or dispatchable demand for hydrogen or power. It's actually very complicated because a hydrogen plant will run for 4 or 5 years at a very, very constant production. So they won't go up and down. It does have a very, very small turn down ratio on a blue hydrogen plant. And the same with some of the technology we discussed on scaling up of green hydrogen. So I think the storage in reality, hopefully, and the supply chain resilience is going to become more and more important.
Very good. Hero, you want to take the floor?
Just adding on the demand side, what I find really interesting, involved with several people on the end use, that I don't believe demand is really the issue. However, being able to supply in quantity is an issue. And that also really should appeal to this group of people, because we're supplying that infrastructure. Interesting one about green steel, so hydrogen-based steel from renewable sources. If you kind of back to a car, then the additional cost for what seems tremendously high cost of decarbonized steel suddenly doesn't become that much of an extra. So the car maker is quite willing to bring that online, to incorporate that, but he can't get it in any near way quantity enough, to build that car in sizable chunks. So for us to step up and answer that demand, Maersk was really reinvented their decarbonization policy, simply because they found out that end users were actually quite interested in decarbonized transportation by ship. And then they realized that they shouldn't have the first ship in 2030, but somewhere around 2026. So they canceled their orders for ships and reordered the ships, but then decarbonized. But again, everyone's looking at everyone, and that may result in nobody doing anything.
Thanks. So I have a question for you, Berend, now related to hydrogen. What is the best way, in your opinion, for a tank storage company to de-risk, if you like, its business case? Apart from having the European Investment Bank and so involved, if there is little upfront demand for a hydrogen product?
Well, that's a good question. I think the easiest thing to do is, if you're like a large diversified company like VTTI, you can kind of, within your portfolio where you have 95% of your other activities are kind of bringing predictable cash flows on stream, you can allow for 5 or 10% of your business to be kind of on a speculative basis, because you can still, you get your money back as a bank from the 90% of day-to-day activities. So it is again like larger companies do have a benefit of testing this out and getting general financing means that they can apply for for hydrogen. And otherwise, it's what I said before. You need long-term contracts, or maybe start with very small pilot projects and build a case. Because as banks, you need to have a 98% probability or more that you get your money back. And if the few here in the audience and in the panel is already that it's a 50% chance, then it's an equity, it's a venture capital risk.
Would you like to comment on it, Mark?
I thought I'd never get the microphone again. So you were worried about me giving long answers. No, I don't have anything specific to add on that. I think we've had some interesting conversations about creating demand as well, and I was really encouraged to hear the positive news about hydrogen demand. Frankly, I think in other sectors, other applications, I'm going to talk about the regulators again. They might need to push a bit harder for certain things to happen, but I think it's good news.
Let me open the floor again to the participants. Do you have some questions related to hydrogen for our experts?
Yeah, I think the hydrogen definitely is a buzzword, and we have no doubt that we have confidence that hydrogen will come. But my question to the panel is when? For the realistically, the cost will come down and make it really a viable fuel. Because I was also at a conference, a hydrogen council, but also here in Rotterdam as well, a few weeks ago, and we talk about to produce currently the installations of the hydrogen our fleet, which means governments provide the funding. So the commercial party, the major oils and energy company, they put small amount to test it out because there's no payback, the cost is not there. So the only vehicle that really using the hydrogen are government fleets currently, and they and also even in Australia, they started to invest. Some state government wanted to get into the process of being hydrogen plant. So from energy, we're talking about, and also we're talking about also the hydrogen trucks, the long haul truck vehicles. You talk about minimum cost is €500,000 per truck. So you talk about the actual vehicles using hydrogen, the cost is high, and also the production of the hydrogen is high, and of course we are facing the challenge of storage as well. And so all that supply chain, currently when and that viability is going to be there to really make a hike of hydrogen to become a very much a viable fuel for us. When? Thank you.
Who would like to comment on this? Okay.
The short answer is who knows, but that's not going to stop me from stating a number. So if we look at this, I think you raised some good points, like who is investing into this. You can put that into, and it comes back to the same comment about whether this is bankable. It comes back to those that can afford to and have a motivation to. So what do you see happening in the world right now? You see governments investing, and you see philanthropic billionaires investing. And these are the ones that want to make the world a better place and can afford to put their money where their mouth is. But what does that mean for us today? I think if you look at these things, there's a few that we've seen in the past. Even the electric cars, they've been around forever. There was even a documentary maybe 20 years ago, Who Killed the Electric Car, which the technology was there, the adoption was not there, but it also came down to the supply of the technology was not scalable and economical. And I think that comes down to what the question is when is this going to be scalable and economical? And if we look at it for hydrogen, we've discussed today is even when we look at the colors of the rainbow, people will want the green hydrogen. And the green hydrogen, if you look we're in Europe at the moment, the ability to source that locally is questionable. The ability to import it is likely what's going to be needed. So that requires partnerships, investment, technology. So to your question, when is this going to be scalable and economical where it is mainstream? I will say at least a decade, and if we're here doing this conference in 10 years from now, I'll take a wager with someone on that. But all the investment is happening now, which is the important bit.
Giacomo.
Yeah, I agree with the timeline. For me, there is one element which is where demand is coming from, which is going back to the previous question, and the demand is not coming from general population feelings, but it's coming from regulation. So it's way more expensive to produce fuels in this way. So green hydrogen is extremely expensive. Even in the few years to come, will be more expensive. Besides maybe few locations where renewables are extremely with very high utilization rate and so on. But in reality, the cost will be higher. So someone needs to somehow impose that. So what happened, for instance, with the electric car, one of the reasons why we're now seeing the electric cars in the fleets is that there is a regulation. So European Commission started regulating Euro 4, Euro 5, so less and less CO2 emissions per kilometers driven, and this is pushing some of the alternative and most efficient cars now in our fleets every day. So Fit for 55 is what is being discussed, and they're discussing very ambitious targets for hydrogen from 2030. Might not be exactly 2030, but I think the point is that it's true, few years will be required, but the other thing is that there has to be a demand, and the demand has to be developed by regulation, otherwise it's not going to happen.
And after regulation, then there is a market. There is simply no market yet. So that is already a problem. So there is no supply and demand, normal structure. And I think we really have to think beyond 2030 before that it actually really has taken place. Before that, there will be an enormous drive to electrify our society and also the industry. So electrification, and that's why I'm looking here at my neighbor here. I think as far as storage of electricity becomes an extremely, when we talk about hydrogen all the time, but I wouldn't mind talking about storing electricity here, because I reckon that is going to be also extremely important for decarbonizing our society. So maybe you would like to say something about it, because you haven't said anything yet.
So finally we are talking batteries.
Yes.
Yeah, sure. No, I think I agree with the previous speakers that it will still take a while before hydrogen really picks up, is used by, let's say, by the society in many respects. Until then, we see a strong movement to electrify the world. That is one of the reasons, and that's what my presentation was about today, about a large-scale storage technology that also has a really nice connection with terminals, with seaport terminals. Anyone who is storing storing gases and liquids is actually a candidate to build a very big flow battery. As I presented, we are doing this currently with Royal Vopak. The nice thing of these terminals that these are also mostly at seaport terminals, so at the coast, and that's also the location where the landlines come in from large sea parks at sea. So there's really a nice, maybe coincidental, but a really nice connection between the hydrogen world and electricity storage.
And typically, once the business is more mature, do you think that there would be a large volume of, let's say, flow batteries within a sea terminal, or do you think it would be limited?
Well, actually, these flow batteries were developed as co-location with sun and wind, obviously to shave the peaks and to make sure that we always have electricity. But seaport terminals, and this is actually, to be honest, the reason why I knocked on the door at Vopak some 4 years ago already. They don't have only the tanks, but they have the complete infrastructure to build large batteries. and we will definitely need very large and long duration storage. So it's not only about tanks, it also has to do, and that's why it's really a good match with, for instance, Vopak. They have a lot of knowledge about storing all kinds of chemicals and gases. And this is what my company lacks. We are the technology company building these batteries, but how to store really very large volumes is somebody that is something that is known by a lot of the people in the audience, I guess. And so no, I actually think that there's really apart from the obvious co-location with sun and wind, there is a huge opportunity to take part in the energy transition for those companies who are storing today fossil gases and fuels. Definitely.
Thanks. Matt, do you think that tank terminals are going to look substantially different to the untrained eye in the future with increased cryogenic storage, potentially floating storages, and so on?
You may not see some of the underground storage as well, I guess, that we may develop as well. So, yeah, I think it will look different, and I'm hoping that I know, Lucia, you have a much broader view than I, but we certainly have demand for the hydrogen projects that we're supporting, and we will enter early stage design towards the end of this year. But I do agree on the timeline; it's very aggressive government policy. And to comment from the audience there, the contracts for difference model or pricing support that's going to be available, similar to wind 15, 20 years ago, is going to be quite interesting to get these projects off the ground, I agree. But the first mover will have the advantage, and we will move on it. I hope our business will look different in 5 years and 8 years, rather than, I don't want to be retiring and not have built anything. So I'm very keen to get these projects moving, and hopefully with some sensible government support. It's taxpayers' money and everything else. But I think, Gary, sorry if it wasn't you, but I think it was you who mentioned in your presentation, it's not a with or without. Navigator has a fantastic fuels business and a fantastic chemicals business, and I hope we have that business, and we grow a hydrogen and an emissions reduction business, a future energy carrier and emission reductions. I want them all. I don't want to lose my fuels business or my oils business. I want to grow that as well. So I think they'll look different, but they may be in different locations as well. Maybe slightly different.
I would like to give the chance again to the audience to ask any questions, and if not, I will wrap up.
Hi guys. Okay, so this might be quite a rogue question, but I was wondering, do you think that there's a specific role that Gen Z can play in holding industry accountable in the energy transition? What do you think that role looks like? Am I jaded by my social media echo chamber and overshooting the pace of this transition? Is the world more divided than I presume? Do you think the energy transition is insulated from the rising tide of populism? So there's a few questions there. Quite a few.
You can take my job if you want. Who would like to tackle some of these?
Okay, fantastic question. And I'd say that what role can they play? A huge role, because I think increasingly it's a voice that maybe used to be a minority, but it's increasingly becoming a wave of monumental proportion, but also of sensible proportion. So having even recently been in Australia over Easter, spending time with some of my nieces and family of a different vintage to myself, what I realized is that without really thinking objectively about it, but since thinking objectively, I have gone on a journey. So I am not what I was 20 years ago. Like in my presentation, I spoke about the different lenses. I was previously one, maybe two-dimensional. But what it has done is it's forced a discussion, it's forced a conversation, it's forced all of us to look in the mirror and decide what do we want to do. And again, it's however you look at it. I mean, if we try to hire anybody now, Back in the day, it used to be an opportunity and a paycheck, but now very much the purpose is front and center of why people want to do what they do, which is why increasingly I said this is an industry which I'm proud to be part of, because we are at the forefront of ensuring that this promise becomes a reality. So the role that Gen Z plays, what I'm hoping, and I think is an inevitability, is that for a decade or so it's been a voice. That voice now needs to become part of the action and getting up that curve to have the increased competence, realize it's complicated, roll up the sleeves and become part of the solution. And I think that is increasingly happening. So it's a positive thing, but having personally been, I wouldn't say infected by it because that's normally a bad thing, but contagious in a positive way, I think it's a very positive aspect that it brings new ideas.
Thanks a lot. I would like to give you the floor now, Lucia, because I think that the work the Hague Centre for Strategic Studies has done for our sector has been really inspirational, and it's been the first time, I think, that our sector has commissioned something with this kind of foresight element. And perhaps you can comment a little bit on what your main takeaways are from the report, but particularly what should we in the room all be trying to do better to prepare for 2030, 2050, and the instability of the current period?
Gee, Rafi, you took me by surprise here. This is a very interesting question, as they say. Yes, we were very happy to do this particular study. Know also that, for instance, I am from the upstream. I have looked for oil and gas in my whole life for a big oil company, and since actually worked in think tanks and actually look at geopolitics and macroeconomics. And I think in the upstream a lot can be done as far as decarbonization, and I'm talking scope 1, scope 2 here, but knowing also that along the whole value chain, that actually should be addressed by everybody along the value chain, including ourselves as being scope 3 for that matter. So there are still a lot of steps to be made. Also on the upstream, also I think for the companies who are here on this stage, I think on the midterm we are going to have a very turbulent and well, I will not say winding road, but a real wobbly road. It's full of geopolitical traps. A lot of insecurity. I already mentioned that in my talk. I'm not very optimistic about the next 10 years with respect to the energy markets, with respect to affordability of energy, and with respect to the speed in which the decarbonization will take place. But I think at one stage, when we actually come over that hurdle, there will be an enormous acceleration towards 2050. And that maybe it will be 2060 in the end of the day. One thing I'm for sure, it will not be 1.5 degrees Celsius, which our planet is going to be heated up. I understand from the World Meteorological Organization that within the next 5 years, there will be maybe a time or 1 year that we already reach the 450 parts per million as far as CO2 emissions content in our atmosphere. Then eventually it will go down again. But I mean, it will be hopefully somewhere between, let's say, 1.8 and 2.5 if eventually we will head. And I think we in the Western world should be, if you like, the example for the rest of the world, and it is an absolute necessity. And therefore the tank storage sector being part of that whole initial fossil value chain, which also have to decarbonize and eventually will come a more cleaner value chain, and being part of that particular new world, which is a cleaner world as far as greenhouse gas emissions is concerned. And although, I mean, I have a lot more detail, I would say read the reports. We have 4 reports. They're not very thick. They're pretty comprehensive. Co-author actually sitting there, Arina, have done a great job. And we were very happy to work for both VOTOP and VETSA to do this work. Thank you.